Thank you for coming. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Glenn Baker, the Chief Financial Officer for the Reagan Foundation. In honor of the men and women in uniform who defend our freedoms around the world, it's our tradition here to start each of our events with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would, please stand and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. The shortest of Peter Thiel's bios used two words. He's an entrepreneur and an investor. I would suggest to you that both words are understatements and don't really do justice to his level of activity, his background, or his impact on the world. First, as an entrepreneur, I would venture to say that every person in this room has been impacted in some way by one of the companies that he has helped to create. As you likely know if you're here tonight, he's one of the co-founders of PayPal. While they did not achieve their ultimate goal of replacing the US dollar, they did manage to create a payment system that has more than 128 million active accounts, and that has made it possible for hundreds of thousands of small businesses to operate on the internet. Maybe if PayPal didn't impact you, how about Facebook? In 2004, he was the first outside investor in and still serves on the board of the social media giant. That same year, he also co-founded a cutting-edge data analytics company called Palantir that makes tools for national security and global finance customers focused on the analysis of big data, providing results that I suspect likely impact us all. After taking PayPal public and then selling the company to eBay, he's become known as the Don of the PayPal Mafia, since he and many of his PayPal colleagues went on to launch companies that have become household names. Companies like Tesla Motors, SpaceX, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Yelp. That was the entrepreneurial side of his two-word bio. On the other side, as an investor, he created and serves as president of Clarium Capital, a global hedge fund. And he also serves as the managing partner in Founders Fund, a venture capital fund focused on identifying and supporting the next generation of technology companies. And he's involved in several other investment companies as well. He also started the Thiel Foundation, a nonprofit organization that defends and promotes freedom in all of its dimensions, political, personal, and economic. He supports the work of diverse organizations like the Oslo Freedom Forum, the Human Rights Foundation, and the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's the creator of the 20 Under 20 Thiel Fellowship, which annually offers 20 $100,000 awards to students under the age of 20 that agree to drop out of school and launch a startup. I know what you're thinking. In launching this, he helped to launch also a public debate on the education bubble and the differences between schooling and learning. Peter himself earned both his bachelor's degree and a law degree from Stanford University. He continues to be active at Stanford and also at the Hoover Institution, located at Stanford, where he serves on their board of overseers. Despite his criticism of the education bubble, in the spring of 2012, Peter taught a course at Stanford entitled CS 183. CS was the computer sciences department. One of his students from there took detailed notes on his lectures and posted them on a blog, which ended up generating more than 1 million page views. That student, Blake Masters, and his former teacher, Peter, have together revised and rewritten those class notes to create the book that we're here to talk about tonight, 0 to 1, Notes on Startups or How to Build the Future. Personally, I found the book to be very insightful. Great insight into how people work together, insight also into how we even those of us who may not be focused on startups every day, might view the world both as it is today and as it may be as the future unfolds ahead of us. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Thiel.
Well, thank you very much for that terrific introduction. It's a tremendous, when you write one of these books, you sort of get to do all sorts of different events. You try to promote it like crazy, and you meet people in all sorts of contexts. But it's this is one of the really fun events. Since Reagan was my favorite president when I was growing up, and I still haven't had, and none have come close since. In 8th grade, I was in 8th grade in 1980, and we sort of had these clips that we had to for my social science class, where we had to sort of pick a president that we liked. We had to sort of take out all the clips from the newspaper, and I was sort of in liberal Northern California. And, I was one of the few people in my class who was backing Reagan back in 1980, and I think that in many ways Reagan was the one president in our lifetimes who believed in entrepreneurship and in the dynamism that really is going to be needed to take our country to the next level in the decades ahead. And so when one teaches entrepreneurship, it's a very tricky subject to teach, because there's a way in which there sort of, I think, are two different ways people tend to go about it, and I try to avoid both of them. One way is you basically tell stories about how you succeeded. And so I would tell all these, I could tell all these stories about what I did at PayPal in 99 or 2000. And they're sort of all very idiosyncratic. There's sort of interesting war stories, but there's nothing you can really learn from them. Sort of combined email with money, which was the idea was, the time was right in 1999. You could not have done that in 1985. 2014, it's too late since it was done 15 years ago. And then the other sort of approach people have is that you have what I sort of describe as these sort of pseudo-scientific approaches to business. We have like this formula, and it's like you follow these 5 steps, and then you'll succeed in building a successful business. And I think that doesn't tend to work either. And the reason is that I think every moment in business, every moment in the history of technology, every moment in the history of business happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg won't build a social network. The next Larry Page won't build a search engine. The next Bill Gates won't build an operating system. And if you're copying these people, there's some sense in which you're not learning from them at all. And so the question that I like to, and so I think it's always this question of the uniqueness and the differentiation of great businesses that one needs to focus on, and that sort of is the theme. And so it's going from 0 to 1 is going to building the first of something completely new that hasn't existed before, and something that's fresh and strange and will make the world a better place in ways we don't yet fully understand. And so I try to get at this through sort of a series of contrarian questions. There's a business version of this question, which is, what great company is nobody building? But there's a more intellectual one, which I always like to use as an interview question, and it's, tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. And this is a really simple but shockingly hard question. It still is really hard even when people can read on the internet that I asked this question and they can prep for it. And it turns out to be a very hard question for two somewhat different reasons. The first is that we tend to believe of truth as simply conventional. Truth is just what everybody says to be true, which I think Reagan was sort of a very interesting counterexample, since he was courageous and was willing to articulate things that nobody else believed at the time. But we tend to normally think truth is simply what everybody says, and it's really hard to figure out something new. So it seems like you have to be really brilliant to answer this question. And then the other reason is that it's always socially a very difficult dynamic, where if you're being interviewed by somebody and you say, okay, well, I believe the education system is screwed up, And see, I thought of that too. I thought the education system was screwed up too. That's a bad answer because everybody already knows that to be true. And so good answers are ones that, somehow are probably quite uncomfortable and that people, and so that they don't require just brilliance, they also require courage. And we're in a world in which courage is in much shorter supply than brilliance. And I think there's sort of always a question of how to do this. So the book 0 to 1, I give a whole series of different answers to this question, things that I believe to be true that most people don't agree with me on. And I will share 3 of these answers with you tonight, and then let's have a discussion and go from there. So answer number 1 is always on this question of how does one go about building a great business, and the thing that I stress is that most people think that capitalism and competition are somehow synonymous, and I believe they really are opposites. That if you're a capitalist, you're in the business of accumulating capital. If you're in a world of perfect competition, all the profits are competed away. And so the goal and this is like the advice to anyone who's starting a company, a founder, an entrepreneur, the goal should be to do something so unique, so differentiated that there's no competition and that you actually have a monopoly, that no one's competing with you. And if you start something that's incredibly competitive, that's my example of sort of a bad business to start is a restaurant. This is sort of the classic example of hyper competitive, and no one ever makes any money. Opposite end of the spectrum, the sort of example I give on the other extreme would be a business like Google, where they sort of built a much better search engine, and then it's the one that everyone uses, and they've had no competition for 12 years, and they make enormous amounts of profits. And this sort of monopoly versus competition distinction is very poorly understood for a lot of reasons. But I think the main one is that if you have a monopoly, you pretend not to have it because you don't want the government to come after you. And if you don't have a monopoly, you will pretend to have one because you'll try to say there's something unique and differentiated about your business. So, for example, if you're running Google, you would never say, we have a fantastic monopoly and that's why we're making so much money. What you will actually say is, you don't even talk about Google as a search company anymore. You would say, we're a technology company and we're competing with Apple on the iPhone, and we're competing with Facebook and Amazon, and we're building these self-driving cars, and we're going to compete with all the car companies, and we're in the space called technology, which is incredibly big and incredibly competitive. There's just competition everywhere. And if you're trying to open a restaurant and you're trying to raise money for your restaurant, trying to hit up some of your friends to get some money for it, and they'll say, well, I don't want to invest in it because a restaurant's a bad business, I'm just going to lose my money. It's no, this is going to be totally different. This is a one-of-a-kind restaurant. It's going to be the only British restaurant in Simi Valley. And so what you do is instead you tell a story where the market is artificially small, and you pretend that you're differentiated in a way where you really are not. And so the people who have monopolies pretend the markets are big and thereby pretend they don't have monopolies. The people who don't have monopolies pretend the markets are super small and thereby appear to have them. And because of this, I think this is sort of the most important idea in business that people generally don't understand. And so we always have this bias of underestimating how important it is to do something differentiated, how tough it is to do something where lots of people are doing the same thing. And sort of the pattern I've noticed that's really valuable in evaluating companies is that when it's something unique that really makes sense, that tends to be really good. When it's something where you've sort of heard it before, that's always sort of a bad sign. You don't want to invest in the 4th online pet food company. You don't want to invest in the 10th thin film solar panel company. You don't want to invest in the 20th pizza restaurant. So those are sort of the bad ways to do it. But I think there's a sort of a deeper reason why competition is often, we're often sort of attracted to competition. So I think it's not just that we don't sort of understand this competition monopoly thing. I think there's also often an inability to understand, we often sort of get attracted to competition because we think that, we sort of think of competition as a proxy for value. So we think if there are lots of people competing for something, it must be valuable. And so we might as well just we're not going to try to figure out if it's valuable. Let's just get in line and see what you can get. Or if there are a lot of people fighting to get something, maybe we should join them and fight as well. And this is sort of at the core of my critique of our educational system, where it's in some ways it's an autobiographical critique, because I was incredibly competitively tracked, and it was sort of my 8th grade junior high school yearbook. One of my friends wrote in, I know you're going to get into Stanford in 4 or 5 years, and sure enough, that happened. And then sort of try to get good grades and good test scores, and I got into the law school, and then I ended up at this big law firm in New York. And it was sort of a very strange place, because from the outside, everybody wanted to get in, and on the inside, everybody wanted to leave. And after I lasted for 7 months and 3 days, and after I left, one of the people down the hall told me, "Yeah, Peter, it's really reassuring to see you leave. I had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz," which of course, all you had to actually do was just go out the front door. But people couldn't imagine doing it, because their whole sense of identity, their whole sense of self-worth was caught up in the ways they had beaten other people in competitions and had gotten to this place, and it didn't matter that it made no sense whatsoever, and it was sort of like a really, really crazy thing to be doing objectively on so many levels, and so I think that's. I think there's something like this at work in very, very many of these competitive dynamics. And if you want to be more precise, competition makes you better at that which you're competing on. So if you're like in high school, if you're on a swim team in high school, you will get to be a better swimmer, because competition focuses you on beating the people around you. But it always comes at the strange price of maybe losing sight of things that are more important or more valuable, and that's always sort of somewhat of a problem. There's a version of this. There's sort of a very strange sort of sociological phenomenon in Silicon Valley, where you get the sense that a lot of these tech companies that are super successful are led by people who seem to be suffering from like a mild form of Asperger's, and I always think that we need to take this fact and we should turn it around into a criticism of our society, and ask the question: what is it about our society, about our culture, that sort of where anybody who's socially adapted and is reasonable, is good at talking to other people, that they end up getting talked out of all of their original, creative, interesting ideas before they're even formed. And they sort of get the sense, oh, that's a little bit too weird, that's too strange, no, that doesn't make sense, people won't like me if I do that. And you're sort of talked out of them before you even have them. They've done these sort of very interesting studies at Harvard Business School, where you can think of Harvard Business School, it's like hyper-competitive, it's sort of people, but the personality type is sort of, I'm not sure what the anti-Asperger's is, but it's sort of the anti-Asperger's. So it's people who are super extroverted, they sort of don't have very many convictions generally, hopefully I'm not offending too many people in the audience here, don't have very many convictions, and hyper-extroverted people, and they spend 2 years in a hothouse environment. At the end of the 2 years, they basically have figured, they've sort of listened to what everybody else is doing, and you sort of have this sort of collective insanity of crowds where they all decide to try to catch the last wave, and normally it's the wrong thing, and systematically, whatever the largest group of people at Harvard do is always the wrong thing. They've actually done studies on this. I was at Harvard Business School where I mentioned the study, and the professor was talking and said, yeah, I was the one who wrote that study years ago. And it was And so the basic study you do is, like in '89, everybody wanted to work for Mike Milken 1 or 2 years before he went to jail. They were never interested in anything with technology in Silicon Valley, except for '99, 2000, just before the dot-com bubble blew up. 2005 to 2007, it was real estate and private equity funds. So it was always the wrong thing. And so I do think the sort of, and this is my thesis, it's sort of the anti-Malcolm Gladwell thesis, where you have sort of the wisdom of crowds. I think you have the insanity of crowds. There's no safety in crowds because crowds are lots of people that you're competing with, and you want to stay as far away from them as possible. The way I sort of summarize this is that there's this line from Anna Karenina, the opening line from Anna Karenina is, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think all happy companies are different because they fail to, they found something that's unique and very differentiated. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. So that's sort of contrarian idea number one. I'll make the other two a little bit faster. Contrarian idea number two is that, coming back to this question, tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. I think sort of one sort of somewhat standard thing people think is, well, all these things have already been figured out. There isn't that much left to discover. And I sort of in my book give three different things. Conventions are things everybody knows to be true. Mysteries are things we can never figure out. And secrets are things that are sort of in between. They're hard to figure out. You have to really apply yourself. But if you really work at it, you can discover something important and new about some part of the world. And most of us think that there are not that many secrets left. They somehow have all been discovered. And I think it's like if you were growing up in the 18th century or 17th century, you could just look at a map and there were empty spaces on the map and you could become an explorer and you could discover new things. And it was a hard thing to do, it was kind of dangerous, but there were some very straightforward secrets left to discover. Or in the 19th century, the periodic table of elements, there was still a lot of that was, more or less empty, and you could find some new elements. And if you're trying to find secrets in geography or basic chemistry in the 21st century, that's a bad idea and you probably should not do it. But I think most things are not like geography or chemistry, and I think there are sort of many of these secrets left, and there sort of are all these fields where there are still a lot of new things left to be discovered. I think certainly the computer field broadly has been one such area. I think there are many other ones that are quite open, and we need to sort of really resist this idea that there aren't that many left. And I think there's sort of this way in which globalization, I think, has played a somewhat destructive role, because when you have 7 billion people on the planet, people always are sort of thinking to themselves, well, I can't figure this out because someone else is smarter than me and would have already figured it out, or it's impossibly hard to figure out. And so you talk yourself out of trying. And so if you think that you're not going to figure out a secret, then you definitely won't be the person to figure it out. So if you think you can't do it, you won't. And so a belief that there are still some secrets left to be discovered is like the necessary precondition for being someone who will discover these. And I think there is always some idea like this behind all these companies. When we started PayPal, I was very interested in the sort of intersection of encryption technology and currency, and sort of this very idiosyncratic area, but that's sort of how you create, a new digital currency. Bitcoin has sort of done it in recent years. We didn't quite pull it off at PayPal, but it sort of was this very inspiring area, and you sort of learned a lot of substance in it. There weren't that many people who understood it. You could actually discover some new things about it, and it gave us the perspective that really helped frame how we built and architected a lot of the payment system that ended up working really well. So I think there's always this substantive passion for some area, and it's important to pursue it, and it's important never to think that you can't figure things out because there are experts or there are smarter people who have already learned everything. It's true in certain areas. It's true in geography, perhaps. It's perhaps true in a few other areas, but there are many domains where that's not the case, and where I think it's always important to think that we can learn things, because that's actually the truth, and that's how we discover more of these secrets. Third contrarian idea that I'll end on is this one's sort of very, very big picture. I think that in my book I sort of contrast two different ways in which progress can happen. There's globalization, which involves copying things that work, going from one to N, and sort of horizontal or extensive progress. And I sort of think of China as the paradigm of globalization. That, it's really straightforward what China has to do in the next 20 years. They just have to copy stuff from the US and Western Europe, and they don't have to actually ever invent anything new. And then there is technology, which is vertical. I always draw globalization on the horizontal axis, and I draw technology on the vertical axis. It's intensive progress. It's doing new things. It's going from 0 to 1. And I want to just always underscore that technology and globalization are two really different things. And they're sort of weirdly get used almost interchangeably as words, but I think they are really, really different. And I like technology a lot more than globalization personally, but they're really different concepts. And if you sort of think about the history of the last 200 years, there have been periods of technology and periods of globalization. The 19th century, you had both tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress. 1914, World War I starts, globalization goes into reverse, world becomes more, less trade, it becomes more divided in all sorts of ways. The Iron Curtain divides the world even more. And you have, but technology keeps going in all these different forms at a frantic pace. 1971, Kissinger goes to China. Globalization starts again, and the last 4 decades have been breakneck, ferocious amounts of globalization. But technology, I think, sort of somehow slows down a fair bit in the late 60s and 70s. And we've had progress around computers, but not very much in a lot of other areas. I think that sort of the simple explanation I give for this is that the world of bits, of computers, has been unregulated. The world of atoms has been regulated. And so most engineering fields were bad ones to go into starting in the 1970s. You didn't want to become a nuclear engineer because you couldn't build nuclear power plants. You didn't want to be an aeroastro engineer because supersonic planes were deemed to be too noisy. You didn't want to go into biotech because the FDA is charging $1 billion for every drug that gets brought to market, and that's more than the $100,000 it takes to start a software company. So it costs $1 billion to start a biotech company, $100,000 to start a software company. You'll have a lot of people starting software companies, not that many starting biotech companies. So many of these other areas I think have gotten a lot tougher to do. The way I've described this is that we landed on the moon in July of 1969. Woodstock started 3 weeks later, and with the benefit of hindsight, that was when the hippies took over the country and the true battle over progress was lost. And so I think that we've had this period of limited technology and ferocious globalization that's very different over the last 40 years relative to the period that we had before. And I want to sort of reflect it in a very different way that we talk about the world. In the 1950s or 60s, you would have talked about the first world and the third world. The first world was the part like the US where things were just getting dramatically better all the time. The third world was this part that was sort of permanently screwed up. And today, people would talk about the developing and the developed world. The developing world is that part of the world that's copying the developed world. And so this is sort of a pro-globalization convergence theory of history. Everything's going to converge. Everything's going to become the same over time. But it's also an anti-technology description of the world, because when we say that we're living in the developed world, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world that's done, that's finished, where nothing new is ever going to happen because it's developed, and that the younger generation should be resigned to having a lower or certainly not a higher living standard than their parents, And I think this is something we should be resisting very strongly. We should not accept this idea that we live in the developed world, and that we should be resigned to we should not resign ourselves to decades of stagnation. And so I think we should always ask anew the very contrarian question of how do we go about developing the developed world. Thank you very much.
Put the camera on there. So we can do that. Oh, yeah. Get the water out. Well, I have a whole stack of questions here, and he just covered all the answers. So, not quite, but so the book is doing very well. You laid out several of the large themes. The reason I enjoyed the book so much was those themes. I mean, I'm obviously in business. I'm not doing a startup here, although we think about those kinds of things here. But as I said in my remarks, the sort of the relevance of this book for a much broader audience, and I think if it's going to do, and I think it is doing well, New York Times bestseller list, it's going to do well with a broader audience. It's because of those themes. One of those, well, let me sort of, so we're going to see some questions come up here as well. Let me kind of come back to the idea of we got some chuckles in the introduction with the 20 under 20 fund. That's obviously touching on sort of one of those themes about kind of breaking through to that sort of, that student that's been in that competitive track and kind of trying to break him out and get him into the world. That was launched in 2010. How's that doing?
Well, it's doing well. I mean, there are all these sort of qualifiers I give. So we don't tell people they should drop out. We just tell people they should stop out. They can always go back to college after 2 years. The colleges always will take people back because it's all gotten to be such an incredible racket where they're all competing on these fake statistics, and one of the statistics is that all their kids graduate. So they're really upset when people go into the program because it makes their statistics look bad, and so they will always take you back. They'll take you back 10 years later, just so that you will graduate. But we've had 83, it's about 20 a year, so we've had about 83 in the first 4 years. Some of them have gone back to college. Most people have been involved in starting various businesses. Some of them have taken off. It's been a phenomenal learning experience across the board. It's basically, we have, sort of many really talented applicants each year. I think the program is on every level sort of working quite well. It's of course it's a very narrow program. It's not like I'm not claiming that everybody should be an entrepreneur, everybody should start a tech company, but it generated like a shocking amount of hostility because we're talking about 20 people, and in a country, it's mostly Americans. I mean, the people from all over the world are eligible. But we're talking about 20 people in the U.S. You have maybe 3 or 4 million kids in every year going to college, and so it's shocking that this is so threatening to this system, that even having a tiny alternative like this is so threatening, and it has triggered a lot of debate because there is something about higher education that has become more and more of a racket. The costs have gone up by 400% since 1980 after inflation. You now have $1 trillion worth of student debt, and there is sort of the sense that in many cases people are not really learning very much. And education itself is an incredible abstraction. Mm-hmm. It's not like a specific field, or it's just being educated. You're getting a diploma of one sort or another, and I think it's and I think that and so I do think we have this education bubble that a lot of people are very anxious about. People don't know what else to do, which is why the system the system keeps going. But the analogy that I've used is that I think our universities, they're sort of facing a crisis similar to that faced by the Catholic Church at the start of the 16th century, like 500 years ago, and that basically you have a system where they're universal. It's a unitary system. There's just one way to do it. There are some differences between the Yale and the Harvard political science faculties. There were differences between the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Maybe they were bigger than between the Yale and Harvard poli-sci faculty, but you and then you have basically, and then you had sort of the system of indulgences, and you had sort of this idea that you could only be saved if you were in the Catholic Church, and we have a similar mindset. You go to Yale or you go to jail. You are saved if you get a diploma. If you don't get a diploma from a college, you will go to hell. And this is what people actually think. And the somewhat disturbing message that I have, like the 16th century reformers, is that you have to figure out how to save yourself, which unfortunately is not what people want to hear. People want some sort of path, some sort of formula, and I'm not sure that really exists.
Interesting. Do we have other questions from the audience? Okay, we've got one back here. I'd ask everybody, if you have a question, raise your hand. We've got people in the audience. Wait for a microphone because we are live streaming this, and we want to get your questions on the live stream.
Can you talk a little bit about the beginning of PayPal, what the inspiration, the challenges and execution, and not just the romantic part, but what did you almost give up, things like that, and also follow up. Would you have supported the spin-off just now with eBay? And what do you think in general of Carl Icahn dictating to, or the reverse of that, meaning why is it that the tech executives are sort of folding over and doing whatever Carl wants? Apple is one, and this is the second one.
Let's see. It's a lot of different questions there. So there was sort of many, I'd say the key insight was combining email with money. The key technology PayPal developed was an anti-fraud technology because there were a lot of bad people who tried to steal the money, and we sort of managed to figure out all these ways to solve it. Palantir was this other company that then sort of used the same approach in the anti-terrorism context, and was actually helped, the software was used to help track down bin Laden in 2010. But I think that, so I think that was sort of we never gave up at PayPal. It was I think one of the critical things in these things is always the people, and it's always sort of a bit of a team effort. It's building one of these companies takes normally more than one person. It takes a few people working together incredibly well, and we had and we sort of the goal we had when we started PayPal was that people were going to be we were good friends to start, and we were going to be even better friends when we were done, no matter what happened. And I think that one of the questions I always like to ask entrepreneurs is the prehistory question of so if some people are starting a company, it's like, so what's the prehistory? How did you meet? What happened? Sort of the bad answer to the question is we met a week ago at a networking function, and we decided to both become entrepreneurs. And that's sort of like, yeah, we met at the slot machines in Las Vegas, and we decided to get married that week, and you might hit the jackpot, but it's probably a really bad idea. And I think the good answer is one where there's a lot of prehistory, and we've been friends in college for many years, and one of us is working on the technology, one's working on the business side, and so I think when you start these things, it's always just the people, and it's what matters a lot is not just whether people are individually talented, but whether they're able to work together and you're going to have lots of ups and downs, and so you have sort of this manic depressive feel where you're going to take over the world, or you're going to get totally destroyed, and you go from one mode to the other several times a day, and so I don't think it makes sense to sort of single out any single one of those points, but it's just if it blows up on any one of the low points, the company's done. And so I think the people working together well is incredibly important, and they normally get destroyed internally way before anything bad happens externally. On the other question, I think it made sense to combine with eBay back in 2002. At this point, most of the volume is outside of eBay. It probably makes sense for PayPal to be a standalone company. Again, 75% of the volume was eBay in 2002. It was down to 50% in 2008. It's down to 25% now. So it probably does make sense to be a standalone. I'm not a fan of Carl Icahn. I don't think he should be dictating to the tech industry. But I do think it's the right outcome here.
Deanna, you have a person back there? Oh, we'll come to you next.
Good evening. And Peter, thank you so much for your time this evening. Sean Singleton with Newcap Partners and Oglethorpe Capital. Considering that you folks like Bill Coleman, Gilman Louie, and Mark Andreessen have one foot in the public sector and one in the private sector, how receptive are senior government and public sector officials to some of the lessons that you bring from Silicon Valley to actually make government operate more efficiently?
Well, I think there is a rather big gap between Washington D.C. and Silicon Valley, to put it mildly. It is. I would say it's hard to know where to really begin. But if you define technology as doing more with less, that's sort of my simple definition of technology, I would say that most of the things our government does are sort of anti-technological in that it's costing more every year to do the same. So we're sort of doing less with more. So it's sort of the opposite. And this is true certainly of the education system, which keeps getting more expensive without producing better results. There's probably healthcare is a little bit more complicated, but there sort of are a lot of aspects of it where it seems to be moving in sort of an anti-technological direction, and the biases are very, very different. Silicon Valley is focused on engineering and substance. Washington, D.C. is, I was a lawyer myself once, but it's dominated by lawyers and process. So you have sort of just completely different kinds of things that are valued and that are important. I sort of describe, and there is sort of, I have sort of a libertarian political leaning where I'm skeptical of government's ability to do things. But I think there has also been sort of a real decline where our government used to be better at science and technology than it is now. And I'm particularly interested in the science technology questions. I mean, there are many other dimensions you can focus on. But you could build an atom bomb in the 1940s. You could do that in 3.5 years. You could get someone in the moon with Apollo in the 60s. In the 80s, people still thought you could build a strategic defense initiative program. At this point, you can't even get a website to work for the Affordable Care Act, and I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake to describe the website failure as in ideological terms and saying, well, of course it doesn't work because the government can never do anything. Because no, I'm sorry, a website is demonstrably inferior, simpler than the Manhattan Project or than Apollo. It is much, much easier. And so we have to acknowledge that there's been an enormous decline that's taken place, and a letter from Einstein to the White House. I mean, it would get lost in the mailroom, and it might be treated as a joke. Who does this person think he is to say that something like this could be built? There are no secrets left. That's sort of the mindset. That's sort of the mindset we have. And so I think the approaches are radically different, and there's a lot of room. I mean, if I had to give sort of the glass half full version, I think that there's enormous room for improvement.
Thank you. We had a question, ma'am, in the second row. I'm sorry. Deanna, we'll get... can we just ask you to ask the next question? Or she's passing up the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're working well together.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've listened and read everything, I think everything, almost everything, and I consider it an honor to be here. It bothers me, of course, about the stagnation the period that we're going through. And I'm a believer that problems are opportunities. And I'm thinking, can you identify, or is it possible to identify, that maybe there's a group or some section of incubation that is going on, that maybe the students that your foundation is developing, they might be the incubation people that will show us the new thing that will happen. I don't know if I hope I'm being clear.
Yes.
In other words, after every stagnation period, there is something brewing, and there is incubation. You know, the egg is thinking.
Yes.
Can you identify that?
Well, there's definitely, so my claim is not that there's nothing that's happening. So there definitely are some places where things are happening. I think there's a lot happening, and there's a lot that's been happening and continues to happen around the computer industry. There are, I think, a lot of other places where we could be doing better. You know, I've been looking in the last few years at various nuclear technologies, and it seems we could be doing a tremendous amount of things. You could build far cheaper, far more efficient, far safer reactors. You know, we have about half the nuclear power in this country is going to go away in the next 10 years because it's going to be obsolete. So, so you either are going to replace it with better, safer, cheaper nuclear plants, or you're not going to replace it at all. And the political trend is not to do it, but you know, it's certainly, from a technology perspective, there's an amazing amount you could do there. You could, you know, my PayPal colleague Elon, who started the SpaceX rocket company, it looks like they're quite close to getting reusability on rockets, which is, you know, they've gotten the rocket up into the air, and from 1,000 feet, they've been able to land it back on the platform. And so the last 1,000 feet is the only 1,000 feet that really matters, so, you know, when you're coming in from space. And so, you know, if every time you flew on an airplane, you had to throw away the whole airplane, air travel would be kind of expensive. And so if you can get rockets to be reusable, that could really open up a space in ways that people can't imagine right now. And I think, you know, I think there is a lot we could be doing in medicine. You know, cancer has been insanely frustrating. I think there's a possibility that there are sort of some of these genomics approaches, some of these new approaches could lead to some real progress in the last decade. Even though, you know, I realize this has been promised for a long time, that we're on the verge of a cure, but I think we may actually be pretty close. And then there are things where I think we're not that close, but I'd like us to be less complacent. So, you know, it's one out of 3 people at age 85 has dementia or Alzheimer's, and it's appalling that we're not even outraged about this. And so, you know, I suspect it's not easy to cure or to reverse, but maybe there are ways to prevent it. Maybe there's a lot more we could do, and that's sort of an instance where our expectations have been lowered so much that, you know, Nixon could declare a war on cancer in 1970. You could not imagine the President of the United States declaring war on Alzheimer's, because it would poll test badly, because people would say, oh, it's not going to work anyway. And so they take a poll, the poll would test badly, you'd never even do something like that. And of course, if you don't think you can do it, then you won't really try, and then you won't succeed. So I think there are sort of a lot of things we could be doing, some straightforward, some a little bit less so.
We had a question over here.
Hi, my name is Richard Burke. I'm an entrepreneur in the area. You talked in your introduction about the challenges in education, teaching entrepreneurship. Maybe you could elaborate on some of the developments in crowdfunding and how that becomes a new training ground for young entrepreneurs and new ideas.
Well, I think the crowdfunding is always a little bit of a different issue where it's a way to get funded for these companies. So I think that there certainly are. So I'd say that the basic challenge, you have all these different challenges for entrepreneurs when you start this. It's unclear what you can learn. So there's always a question: what body of knowledge would you want to have? There's a sort of separate issue that's always really central: is how do you raise money, which is always incredibly hard. And one of the places where people with an engineering background are somewhat delusional, people with a science background are massively delusional, is they always think that new ideas, new inventions sell themselves. So if you have something, and the scientists are almost always just completely delusional on this, and this is probably something about science education that sort of distorts their thinking, but it's like, I've discovered something new, and the whole world's going to beat a path to my doorstep to buy my invention or pay me for it, and nothing of the sort ever happens. And so when you trying to raise capital for these things is incredibly hard. The first small round we did at PayPal was in February of 1999. We raised $500,000. We had sort of a whole series of financing rounds. March 2000, 13 months later, we raised $100 million. It was much easier to get the $100 million in March of 2000 than to get the $500,000 in February 99. And it's like you met with people and it was like, okay, maybe I'll give you $25,000. It was like in a Chinese restaurant. Not sure. Let's see what the fortune cookie says. Of course, the fortune cookie said something positive, and that didn't matter. And so it's always the initially jump starting these things is really hard, and one of the dynamics that makes raising money so hard is that there's always this it's always this crowd competition thing that I alluded to in my comments, where there's always sort of people don't want to be the first ones to invest. They want to see other people do it. They want to see other people validate it. And so whenever you're doing something new, it's like this incredible chicken and egg problem, because you have all these sort of lemming-like, sheep-like investors who only want to invest in things other people are already investing in, and so that tends to always be the classic dynamic. I've often thought that when I'm in meetings with investors, there are all sorts of questions they ask, but the only question they have, which they're always too embarrassed to ask, is, well, are other people investing in it? Do other people want to invest? And that's the one question people always have. They never want to ask it because they want to always pretend that they're making up their own mind and they're not influenced by other people at all. And it's disturbing how untrue that is in practice. And so I think crowdfunding is sort of a way to try to get around all these dynamics. And so it's often, but yeah, I think often getting the initial capital is really critical.
Got several gentlemen right here.
Hi, Peter. I was wondering if there's anything like a particular mindset, such as people believing the world is flat, that's keeping people back from discovering those secrets that you're talking about.
The why questions are always hard to answer. I guess the mindset I'm most inclined to say holds people back is the idea that they can't do something, that or that the future, more generally, that the future is a problem for other people, and so the future, well, that's going to be figured out by people in Silicon Valley, or in Silicon Valley, it won't be done in my company, it'll be done in a startup, or if you're in a startup, well, I'm just doing this silly app on an iPhone, so it'll be some other startup that's really doing it. And so, I think the mindset that holds us back in all these ways is always this idea that that other people are going to do it. And there's an optimistic or a pessimistic version of that mindset. So the hyper-optimistic version is that the future is going to be just incredible. This is like the Ray Kurzweil stuff. I'm actually quite critical of Kurzweil. It's sort of the singularity is near. We're going to have this fantastic utopian future. It's going to happen, and there are all these exponential curves that describe it, and all you have to do is sit back and eat some popcorn, and it's like this movie is just going to happen on its own. And then there's a hyper-pessimistic version where nothing's ever going to work and nothing will get done. And what's very interesting is extreme optimism and extreme pessimism, I think, are practically identical because they both lead you to doing nothing. Because if you're extremely optimistic, no need to do anything. If you're extremely pessimistic, no point in doing anything. And so I think that a really good mindset to have is always an intermediate one, and which stresses human agency and not so much the future as something that's predetermined. Or the human agency that will determine the future. It's not the future already exists and will happen no matter what, one way or the other. And so I think sort of somewhere between optimism and pessimism is always the healthiest. There's a slightly different version of this with we had all these great companies come out of PayPal, and there's always sort of the question, why was PayPal so successful at this? And it's always hard to answer. Again, hard to always answer. Any question that starts with why, I always think is really hard to answer. But the answer I kind of like is that the main lesson we learned at PayPal was that it was hard but possible to build a great company. There's a lot of stuff that went wrong, but at the end, it still succeeded. And so the high-level lesson you learned was that it's hard but possible to build a great business. And almost every context people find themselves in, they learn a totally different lesson. So most of the time, people end up at companies that fail in this sort of entrepreneurial context. And then the lesson they learn is that it's impossible to build a great business, and so I'm going to try to build a much more modest business. So that's sort of a self-defeating lesson, and that's analogous to the extreme pessimism. Or you're at a super successful company like a Microsoft or a Google, and the lesson you learn there is that it's easy and automatic. And if you think it's easy to build a great business, then that's like the extreme optimistic one. You also fail. So again, if you think it's easy or impossible to build a great business, again, those are opposites, but in a way they get you to the same result, which is if you think it's easy or if you think it's impossible, you will fail. If you think it's hard, that's like that's the mindset you have to succeed.
There's time for probably two more questions. So why don't we get one over on here on the wing. We've got one in the front row here.
Hi, yes, my name's Rich. I'm a junior at Claremont McKenna. I've had the pleasure of meeting several of your fellows, Spencer, Delian, and my question to you is, I see a lot of my classmates who have been learning computer language for the better part of 10 years. They seem to have a big jump start on many of us in this respect. How important is the understanding of computer code to being a prepared citizen for the future? It seems that we're increasingly disconnected from a lot of the algorithms and other forces that now govern our life. I certainly don't think that it's, I don't think it's necessary for being a citizen at all. I mean, I do think it would probably be a good thing for people to learn. I don't think it's, I don't think it's necessary to understand what's going on or to be an effective citizen. I don't think it's even necessary to be very successful in Silicon Valley. I mean, I think that, there's always, I think all these great companies, it's always some combination of technology and business, and they're these very, they're somewhat different skill sets, and they're somewhat complementary. So I'm still always a very big fan of the 2-person founding team, 1 technology person, 1 person more on the business side, and sort of 1 person's building it, 1 person selling it, and I think that combination really works.
One last question. We have one in front here. Can we go to the microphone?
Thanks, Peter, for a great presentation. I'm also an entrepreneur. I'm in my 2nd year building my business, and I can relate to a lot of things you said, meaning being courageous, travel less, travel path. Having said that, entrepreneurs odds are against us, meaning 90% entrepreneurs do fail within the first year, I believe, and 95% fail within the first 5 years, or 3 to 5 years. And I was just wondering, what are your advice for people who are in the process of building their business? How do we face our challenges, and how do we best maximize our resources to achieve our goal in the most efficient manner?
Let's see. So yeah, it's always hard to sort of answer these questions in sort of in the complete abstract. But I would say it's some combination of the people you work with. So I think the team part's really important. I already talked about that. I think, and then I think it's always, it's sort of like what it is you're doing. And then there's always sort of the strategy part that I think is a really interesting set of questions to ask. And one of the themes that I talk about in my book is how we don't have that much of a sense of the future anymore, and it's very hard to imagine, even describing the future in very concrete ways. So if you sort of ask, when were the last political speeches, you use a political context, when were the last political speeches in which a political leader described a future that looks very different from the present in very clear terms? It was like Martin Luther King, I have a dream, sort of very clear terms of a country that would look very different. The last one that I can think of and that I always cite is the Reagan speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. So it's again, very clear terms describing a future that looks really different from the present. And we generally don't have that sense of the future at all anymore. There's, the Hollywood movies on this are always incredibly anti-scientific and anti-technological, and they show a future in which technology doesn't work and it kills people, and you can choose between the Terminator or the Matrix or Avatar or Elysium. I watched the Gravity movie the other day. It was like, you'd never want to go into outer space. You'd want to be just back on that muddy island, and so we have, and so to the extent we have ideas of the future, they're always like really. Look, they look scary. The future's a place you don't want to be, and I think this inability to have a idea of the future, when you then sort of transpose this to business, what ends up happening an awful lot is people. It all becomes just tactical. It's you basically think about what do you have to do this week, this next week. But there's no strategy of where do you want to be in 10 years, and so and we always say, well, you can't come up with that, but I always think that's a really valuable exercise to go through and actually to have a plan. I used to play a lot of chess as a kid, and one of the tactic in chess is always to be white and move first, and if you start with white, you have an advantage that's about 1/3 of a pawn. So it's a tiny advantage, but it's good to sort of go first. So that's like a tactical advantage. But there's Capablanca, the former world chess champion, had this line: you must begin by studying the end game, because what matters is not how things start, but how they end. You have to begin by studying, how are you going to win at the very end? And I think one of the intermediate chess lessons I learned was you should always have a plan, and even a bad plan is a lot better than no plan. And so, and I think that's, and so yes, I think if you have a 10-year plan, you are much more likely to be in business in year 10 than if you have no 10-year plan, even if it's a bad 10-year plan. You can change the plan or whatever. So always have a plan.
Good advice.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.